This week on the Wheelhouse. What's in a generation? How do they get their news? How do they engage? Today we're all about one generation, Gen Z. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. It's a show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. USA Today says Gen Z is the most politically divided generation. Hey, one of our guests today even split them up into Gen Z 1.0 and Gen Z 2.0 because of differences in views expressed by younger Gen Zers to their elders. Despite these differences and a feeling of disassociation many of them may have with politics, they're still having fun online, as we got to know when we hit the streets to speak with many of them. Today on the Wheelhouse, get to know Gen Z. And here to help me do that is Elena Moore. She reports on politics from NPR's Washington desk. Good morning, Elena.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for talking to us this morning. I appreciate it. Rachel Janfaza is the founder of The Up and Up, a media and strategy firm focused on Gen Z. Thank you so much for joining us on the Wheelhouse.
Thank you for having me.
So happy to have you on the show. And back on the Wheelhouse for more is political correspondent for Vox, Christian Paz. Good morning, Christian.
Good morning. It's fun to be here.
So happy to see you amidst this heat. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Folks, are you part of Gen Z? What events have shaped your political views? Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Rachel, Gen Z includes people born between 1997 and 2012. If you're keeping score at home, that's aged 13 to 28. What are some of the most generation-defining events that have shaped their lives?
So when you think about the lifespan of Gen Z, this is a cohort that was born either just before or just after 9/11, and it's really been a string of crisis and chaos since then. Most recently,
we lost Rachel there for a second. We'll pick it back up once she gets there, but she's essentially saying that this is a cohort that was born right after 9/11 and crisis after that. Not sure if we have Rachel back yet, but I will go to Elena to help us continue that pattern. What are these crises that we're seeing? If you could continue Rachel's thought for her.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you think about being a kid in, the early 2000s, maybe you were in middle school during the Great Recession, maybe your parents lost a job, you're a kid during the Iraq War, it goes past just 9/11, which obviously changed the world. Then when this generation gets to adulthood or young adulthood and they start to develop their own opinions and get, their own, be independents, their first election, the first election that anyone in Gen Z was eligible to vote for, the eldest in that generation, was 2016. So on top of a childhood that has been, defined by all of these very generational defining moments, the first time they were able to make their voices known in a presidential election was this election from Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. And their entire political adulthood has been really side by side with President Trump's time in national politics.
Yeah, that 2016 election seems to be a very important one. Nonetheless, I believe we have Rachel back. Rachel, could you just help me understand really quickly? I think you've written about this, that there's actually like a divide between Gen Z in terms of a 1.0 and 2.0 split.
yes. So when you think about the 15-year time frame of Gen Z, there's been so many different events and experiences that have really shaped two separate cohorts in this generation because so much has happened so quickly, both with the pandemic and with the rise of social media during the adolescence of Gen Z. So the way that I frame Gen Z 1.0, Gen Z 2.0 is split by how old you were during the time of the pandemic. And I believe that anyone who had graduated high school by the time that the pandemic started, they had a very different experience during and after the pandemic than anyone who was still in high school or younger at the time that COVID-19 started. If you think about those who had been on the oldest cusp of Gen Z, like myself, we had already had a taste of independence in adolescence by the time that the pandemic hit. And that was really different than students who were in elementary school, middle school, high school during the time that the pandemic started, had never lived outside the home, were under 18 at the time. But it's not just about the educational experience, it's also the social media platforms that shaped their time growing up. I had a flip phone before I had an iPhone. For members of Gen Z 2.0, they don't know what a flip phone was. I mean, there has been a little bit of a resurgence with them recently, ironically, but when I was in high school and college, TikTok didn't exist. It wasn't a thing. Whereas for those who were in high school, middle school, even younger during pandemic and beyond, TikTok has completely shaped their upbringing. It is the cultural touch point. It shapes what music they're listening to, what trends are popular, what clothes they're wearing, and also political views.
So I'm trying to understand this a little bit further. I love this delineation of the pandemic. I think that's very helpful. Help us understand, Rachel, if this kind of shifts how somebody might vote once they are able to. Maybe they got out of high school and then they're first eligible to vote during the Harris-Trump candidacy of 2024. How might this shape their political views? How might what happened during the pandemic or what didn't happen for some folks, maybe having to stay at home during the pandemic, how might that shift their vote?
Totally. So during the pandemic, especially for the Gen Z 2.0ers who were in high school or middle school at the time, they were really the guinea pigs for a lot of the COVID restrictions and protocols that were in place. And if you were a young person who felt like your life wasn't in your own hands and your ability to socialize with friends or play in sports games or have prom or graduation was kind of at the whim of this virus and then the authority who was in charge making these decisions about your ability to just do these very normal adolescent things, there was a lot of resistance to that developed and a lot of anti-authority sentiment. And while the pandemic started when President Trump was in office for his first term, many of the protocols about masking and vaccine mandates and school reopenings and things like that happened during the start of the Biden administration. And so young people who grew frustrated with these protocols looked at the person or the administration who was in charge at the time. And in many of the liberal cities where these restrictions lingered on past perhaps when young people thought they could have or should have, the people who were in charge in many cases were Democrats. And a lot of resistance to that started to brew and started to spread online as well. And so there started to be a lot of anti-democratic sentiment that bubbled up and also just anti-authority sentiment. Couple that with the fact that if you were shaping your political views during this time, young people are typically always in the counterculture. And while Biden was in office, the counterculture was MAGA and the MAGA movement. And I think this is in part why we've seen a shift to the right amongst some young people, particularly amongst young men who may have been the most frustrated by the fact that, they were confined to their home during these really formative years.
Yes, a lot of this gets put on Democrats, as it has in Connecticut. We know that Governor Ned Lamont here faced a lot of flack for local mask mandates and such. Donald Trump was also president for 10 months or something like that during the pandemic as well. But Biden does get a lot of that criticism. Elena, how is that impacting things in terms of the polls? Are you seeing that same kind of shift where some of the 2.0s or maybe shifting towards a MAGA belief system?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I will always credit Rachel's kind of designation of these two splits is spot on. I think you can see it even as we start to see emerging leaders in Gen Z. The emerging leaders of this generation are that elder generation still. And so it's going to be really interesting to see when some of that younger part two cohort starts to have even louder voices. And that might make this split even more clear. I think that another really, I think the polls, it's interesting because it's very hard to actually split up. Even getting good polling on voters under 30 can be difficult, let alone splitting that in two. We have seen certain, universities like Yale University and Harvard University do in-depth polling on young voters. And we have seen that mid-generational split on party, which is really fascinating. And I will say, even though I think, again, Rachel's point is spot on these mid-generational defining things that split this generation, I think those roots that I spoke about earlier, those early moments that really kind of made this generation what we initially thought it was, I think a lot of those things still kind of read true throughout the generation. It's a generation that isn't afraid to, speak out against even the party maybe they vote for often. We've seen, conservative-leaning young people, liberal-leaning young people criticize the party that they support. And, that's a similarity that I think is quite unique to this generation.
I appreciate that perspective, Elena, because now I'm thinking about my kids. I'm thinking about how parents, probably parents of Gen Zers, were panicking about cash in 2008. And that might be something that really influences their kids and how they're talking. And now that we're going through a bit of a financial crisis here in 2025, I better keep my mouth shut around my kids so I don't make these Gen Alphas very reactive towards changes in their life. I do want to now go to some tape for y'all. Let's hear from Gen Zers. I'm going to point this question to Christian after we're done hearing the tape. Is Gen Z sold on our political system as it stands now? We hit the streets to find out. Here's Sasha St. Germain of Torrington and Isaac Cuevas from New Britain.
It's just unfair, and I feel like we're slowly going back into the 1800s, and I'm not with it at all.
Is there one particular issue that you feel like we've gone really far back on?
Women's rights, including health rights.
Am I sold on our current political system? I would honestly say no. I kind of don't like where our democracy is going. And I think a lot of Gen Zers would agree, because I think politically a lot of us are more often leaning left. And right now we're currently in a right-wing majority.
Isaac says one particular issue he cares about: the war in Gaza and U.S.'s support to Israel. What about the question, Christian, that we asked Sasha and Isaac, and what did you think about their responses?
Yeah, I think overall, it's easy to say that Gen Z, just as it has been the trend among voters when they tend to be younger, they tend to be a little less informed. They tend to be a little less aware of how systems work, which naturally leads to some sense of distrust. On top of that, there is an additional aspect of Gen Z pessimism that is kind of permeated around social media, that shows up in popular culture and shows up in a lot of our mainstream reporting on this generation, the most anxious generation, people with severe mental health, crises in Generation Z. The pandemic destroying abilities to create friendships or to develop social relationships with each other. I do think that it's important to divide, though, Gen Z up and think about it along lines of social trust and along lines of engagement with news. Because one thing that I find pretty interesting is that this idea of trust in institutions really depends on how just engaged these young people are. A lot of higher information, better informed young voters who tend to be college educated, if they are strong partisans, like if they believe in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, they do trust institutions. They do have a sense of how the parties work, how government works. This is why they're, participating in electoral or activist politics. If you have younger voters who are not college educated or are not strong partisans, don't have strong ideological beliefs, which is a huge part of Gen Z, then you do have a sense of distrust in institutions, mostly because they don't understand how they work. And this is partially why they don't necessarily vote. And I think that's why last year was really interesting, because usually the parties are trying to, or really usually Democrats are trying to appeal to that first group, because those are the people that they can count on to turn out to vote. Those are the folks who would probably be upset that the party isn't more to the left, but they can make a compromise on that front. And Republicans tend to just give up that demographic of young voters in general. And last year, what we saw was a pretty strong attempt by the party to reach that second category of voters who tend to not believe, not trust, not really understand how the system works. And speak to a sense of frustration and an overriding sense among the electorate, but especially among Gen Z, because they don't seem to have that many strong political views, attachments to parties, to kind of just, throw up, blow up the game completely and just vote out whoever's in charge and shake up the status quo and the establishment.
And Rachel, you heard there Isaac saying that he thinks that people in his generation tend to lean more left, yet the current system in the United States, the current federal government, is controlled by the Republican Party, essentially, so it leans right. Are you hearing that among a lot of Gen Zers? Is there actually a lot of liberals among Gen Z, or is it starting to skew the other way?
I am hearing an overall sense of dissatisfaction with both political parties. And given what Christian just said, I would push back on that a little bit too. I'm hearing this even from some of the most politically engaged and involved young people on both sides of the aisle who feel like they, even if they are highly educated, and I do think on the whole, this generation is very aware of current events and the news. They're watching all of these events take place in real time with a constant string of breaking news notifications at any given point. They're seeing so many people whose lives are affected. And a core value to Gen Z is empathy. And I think part of this is because they have been able to watch other people's lives unfold through their own personal experience and perspective. And one of the most common phrases that I hear young people bring up, I even just heard in a listening session last night, they kept coming back to this idea of lived experience. And so I think because young people feel that they're in such close proximity to the lives of so many other people, even people who look like or think differently than them, they feel that their pain is their pain. And I think that that's a part of the ideology of Gen Z across the board, whether you're a conservative or a liberal. But to get back to your original question, there is frustration across the board. It is not isolated to one particular party. And one of the biggest trends that I've been tracking really since I started covering young people in 2018 is this idea of political homelessness. And I think that during the first Trump administration, we saw young people who felt just politically frustrated, politically homeless, and that perhaps shifted them more to the left. And now I think, given that there hasn't been, since the 2024 election, a clear message from Democrats about where they're going from here, that is leading a lot of young people who maybe did consider themselves a Democrat to say, I actually don't know really where the party stands right now. And while they may not agree with what President Trump is doing, they don't necessarily see an alternative that they align with. And so it leads them to have many questions about where they stand. At the same time, I think there are a lot of young people who did feel frustrated ahead of the 2024 election, maybe did vote for President Trump, but aren't set in stone Republican voters. They are not conservatives. They might have felt attracted by the MAGA movement, but they might be frustrated by the rising costs, by the cost of housing, by the job market, by the possibility of what AI is going to do to the job market. And so overall, I think there is a lot of malleable beliefs. And what I would sort of hone in on is that young people are not loyal voters. They are not set in stone with either party. And it is really up to the politicians and those who are trying to court their votes to listen to them, to hear what their concerns are, and to meet them where they are. And right now, I'm not exactly quite sure at the national level who's doing that.
But this is something we have to kind of rely on anecdotally. And Rachel, this is the exercise we try to do too, in trying to just talk to people, because it's not necessarily something that the numbers are going to bear out yet. Or is there some quantifiable data to this?
Like Elena said, there has been some data that came out of the Yale Youth Poll showing, confirming this shift to the right amongst the younger members of Gen Z 2.0. And there also was some Gallup polling that I had written about last year showing that Gen Z teens had said that they were more conservative than their parents at a higher rate than millennials had when they were their age. So there is a little bit of hard data on that, but to your point, a lot of this is anecdotal. And I think, the other thing is the number of young people who identify as independent or non-party affiliated. And there's been quantitative data showing that for a few years, the number of Gen Zers who don't identify with either party. And I think that speaks to this politically homeless sentiment and cohort that I was describing a few minutes ago.
How about the desire, Elena, to challenge the status quo show up in who runs against older elected officials? So who in Gen Z challenges those in power already?
Well, I think we have an interesting parallel right now where 2018, we saw that first midterm election year, which many people described as in some ways a referendum on Trump's, first year in office. And that's when we saw folks like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is a millennial and was elected as one of the youngest folks in Congress. It was a huge upset. She was a big progressive. Cut to 2022, we had our first Gen Z member of Congress elected in Florida, Maxwell Frost, also a progressive. And I think a lot of people have been inspired by that, playbook, so to speak. But it's a really hard one to replicate. I mean, in AOC's case, that was in many ways a huge upset. She was a sleeping giant. Her opponent in the Democratic primary was not expecting a hard race. And now Gen Z's political potential and uncertainty is talked about a lot. And that idea of what does this generation have to say? How are they going to make their voices heard? It's a little harder to be under the radar, but you're still facing a lot of these institutional barriers of fundraising, networking, just reps on learning how to campaign. But that being the case, we are seeing, like 2018, a rise of folks kind of coming in and announcing candidacies for office, in part fueled by this anger and dissatisfaction with the current state of play, with the way for many of these progressives, their party, Democrats, are handling Trump 2.0. And I think that is in some ways similar to what we saw in 2018, but it's like a new version of that, because we've seen this movie before in some ways, Trump's second term. But now, instead of it just being a referendum on Trump and wanting new people to fight Trump, as they would say, it's also, as Rachel was saying, a lot of young people have been saying for years now that they weren't exactly on board with former President Biden. There were folks, even with Harris, though she got more support in the polls leading up to the election, she was still also struggling to make the same approval numbers that Biden had in 2020. And so I think a lot of young people this time around are announcing candidacies to both, as they would say, counter Trump, but also to reframe their own party and give people kind of a new voice to look to. But like I said, that is a hard path to walk, and it's a hard thing to do. And so we'll see how many of them are successful.
Christian, can we talk about power and agency real quick?
Yeah.
When you talk to these folks, you hear that Gen Z wants to distance themselves from the political sphere, in part because they don't feel heard, or like that anybody wants to hear what they have to say. If you do, is that unique to them, or do a lot of other gens feel the same at a different point?
Yeah, I do think that there's one aspect where sometimes we think that Gen Z is just completely unique and completely different from any other kind of generation, and we end up seeing maybe a different reaction to some of the underlying challenges or trends that have affected other generations as well. I think on this front, it's interesting because of how the parties respond to that sense. It's really interesting to me to note that we're seeing kind of a retreading of what's happened with other generations in terms of, like we were just talking about, who is running for office. One of the big revelations from last year was, just the confirmation of just the difference between the kind of people who'd want to staff and want to run for office and want to speak for their generation, and the voters that are out there who, there are some who will respond to that, and some who maybe don't necessarily want, big, drastic ideological change within the party. Because one thing that I'll know is that some of the candidates that we're running now, we either see a divide between candidates that are just speaking about change and generational change in the abstract without really offering much of a direction for what that means. And then some candidates who specifically say, progressive policy, left-leaning policy, I'm thinking here of like one of the lessons that was people tried to draw out from the New York City primary, which was like, we need a exciting leftist, progressive kind of Democratic Party to re-excite young voters, when what we clearly saw from 2024 was that the new young voters that we're talking about are much more like, Gen X, are much more like boomers, actually. And this kind of gets to a larger point that I think about a lot, which is I do think that Gen Z isn't necessarily the most unique generation. I think that millennials were actually the most unique generation. I think that, and this goes back to just how distinct the millennial experience was when we talk about smartphones, when we talk about politics and populism, when we talk about the uniqueness of the Obama era and the effects of the recession and the Iraq War. I think what we're seeing with Gen Z actually is a bit of a reversion to the way that other generations that weren't millennials kind of viewed politics and approached the political system. We do have the added complication of things like TikTok, of things like AI, and of the pandemic. But again, this just goes back to my defense of the millennial generation as our greatest generation, actually.
Yeah, I want to pick that up, but I can't do it now because I got to go to break. From Connecticut Public, this is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. You're listening to NPR's Elena Moore, the Up and Up's Rachel Janfaza, and Christian Paz of Vox. We're going to take a break, but after a look at where Gen Z turns for news and how that may be shaping their political perceptions. Are you part of Gen Z? What's your take on politics and the news? Let us know by giving us a good old-fashioned phone call. 888-720-9677. Hit us up. 888-720-9677. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. We're in the middle of getting to know more about Gen Z with three reporters who cover the generation. Still with me are NPR's Elena Moore, CNN's Rachel Janfaza, and Christian Paz of Vox. Want to hear from you if you're a Gen Zer. Where do you get your news? Let us know. Do you think millennials are the greatest generation, as Christian Paz just said? Maybe you want to give us a call about that. 888-720-9677. Christian must have had maybe a little hot sauce in his drink this morning or something like that. One of those great. What do we have at the morning? I'm forgetting what the drink is right now. It's got horseradish, Bloody Mary. Maybe he had a spicy Bloody Mary this morning. What do you think about that, Rachel and Elena? And help us understand where you identify. I know that you're a cusper, right, Elena?
I am a cusper. I'm a 97 on so we toe the line, Rachel and I. We've talked about it for years, but
I'm a millennial. What about you, Rachel?
I'm a Gen Zer too, a cusper though, born in 97 as well, like Elena.
So you're very close. What do you guys think about the generations and at least what they're going through?
Well, I mean, I would just say, I would, respectfully push back to a little bit of what Christian was just saying on, I think that we have to be very cautious on kind of looking at any of these examples of young progressives moving up and being successful as a playbook potentially elsewhere in the country. I think when you look at some race like Mamdani's, which, he's a democratic socialist. He talked a lot about a lot of progressive issues, but his number one issue was the economy. And I think that we do see a lot of overlap still in this generation that, as Rachel has said, is in some ways politically homeless, a lot of overlap on these issues. They're passionate about issues. And in many ways, it's an issue that is a bipartisan one. It's just people have different takes on how to solve it. And that's economic inequality, housing affordability, healthcare affordability. And those are things we hear Dems talk about. Those are things we hear Republicans talk about. And in many ways, strategically so, because we know Americans across demographic groups feel this, but it's something young people are passionate about. And I will just say, when I was out covering the 2024 election, and I would go to Republican events and see candidates try to appeal to young people, the phrase you heard over and over again that I would argue worked in the election is they would say, we want to give you a life that's better than your parents. And that's something you hear politicians say on all sides. And that's kind of a Mamdani-like message that's really all over the place. So I think that there's a lot of issue overlap, and that's kind of what's driving these partisan alignments of young people rather than a label of, Mamdani's more progressive. How is that going to work in a place like, that is more of a purple state? And I think that's a big part of it, is that just the issues are driving this conversation. And there's a ton of overlap between people who are driven by issues on the left in a way that a Bernie Sanders voter might, in the same way that they might be kind of driven by economic issues and vote for Trump this last fall.
You said, as we finished out that segment, Christian, you also said that there's a lot going on now between AI and the pandemic and things like that kind of popping up, at least for Gen Z. So how might technology and the ability to kind of curate your own information stream be influencing the kinds of political content young people engage with?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting dynamic because it's kind of a self-reinforcing cycle. Like AI, post-pandemic, just proliferation and destruction of any kind of monoculture, it kind of allows for the creation of echo chambers, allows for algorithms to continue to define and determine what information you're seeing, and the role of AI, the role of crypto, these newer issues that emerged in the post first Trump presidency era, add a lot more noise. And I think the big issue here, and this is why I defined at the beginning the difference between low trust, high engagement, low engagement. And one thing that I would add in there is a dividing line of whether young people seek out information or they encounter information in the wild. Because I do think most of Gen Z encounters information, isn't necessarily seeking it out. And in many cases, that's a problem because we have more noise. We have, the illusion. This is one of the reasons why I worry for Gen Z in a way, because they feel like they're informed. They feel like they know about issues. The empathy that Rachel was talking about earlier is apparent in the generation, but we haven't had a generation that has encountered such a flood of information in this way that does confuse and does add a little bit more chaos to their decision-making processes, to their trust in various institutions and parties. This is why I was worried, for example, last year when TikTok was becoming one of the primary ways that young people specifically, were getting information, was trying to determine if being a TikTok news consumer had an effect or if there was any kind of correlation between that and political views. And one thing that I did notice in a lot of the polling that did try to tease out this question, and we did have a bit of this, was that there was a bit of polarization that resulted as a part of being a TikTok news consumer when you were young. You either had much more left or much more right views. And it does suggest that some of these algorithmically powered whether social media platforms or news systems, or even the emergence of podcasting as a medium that a lot of young people are using to quote unquote get informed, does present the possibility for more echo chambers, for more siloing of information. And yes, I would argue that perhaps the older part of Gen Z was better at this in parsing out what was true, what wasn't, what they could trust, what they didn't. And in terms of just like encountering a world before this was the standard, the norm. I don't know what is happening with the youngest part of this generation, and how they're responding in a similar way, whether they are media literate, whether they are able to tell the difference between AI and reality. And so on that front, I think we are embarking on a new course. And so we'll see what happens with the youngest cohort and with the oldest part of Generation Alpha as they also end up entering the electorate.
Very controversial headline that came from the Washington Post recently after the federal government took away $2.1 million from Connecticut Public and then some money away from NPR as well. After that happened, there was a headline out there that said that one generation got its news from Elmo, and now another one is going to get it from Skibbity Toilet. That was the controversial headline that Washington Post had. Hey, Rachel, we're all trying to pin down Gen Z somehow. In a moment, you'll hear how we tried to find out where they get their news. I imagine political parties are trying to do the same thing. How are they, if at all, reaching Gen Z? Is it an in-person connection? Is it online? Is it the algorithmic kind of solution that Christian was talking about?
There's a mix of ways. And I think the reality about this generation is that because of how fragmented our media ecosystem is, and because of the fact that really anyone can create their own content, and in the words of Elon Musk, but this existed before him, be a citizen journalist, people are getting their information from so many different avenues, mediums, people, that there is not one single way to reach Gen Z as a politician. And I think that part of the conversation ahead of the 2024 election and in the aftermath has been about the podcast ecosystem and the manosphere. And everyone wants to crack the code on how to reach young voters and young men in particular by going through these sort of alternative modes of communication. And that is super smart and strategic, and any politician should be doing that. But at the same time, it's not the only way to reach young people. And not everyone who's a young person under the age of 30 is listening to these podcasts, even if you look at young men. And the moral of the story is that Gen Z is not monolithic. No generation is monolithic. No group of people is monolithic. And so in part because of how many different creators and modes of communication there are, everyone's getting their information a little bit differently, which definitely makes it hard for politicians, perhaps harder than in the past when there was, the nightly news that they could go on and deliver their message. But there's also an opportunity because you can reach young people really anywhere. And the other reality is that, this is a very information hungry generation. And part of their skepticism comes from a curiosity. I think they are deeply eager to hear about the world around them. And there's an opportunity there for politicians to tap into. And, I think one of the takeaways that I've been honing in on since the election was really that what this generation is craving is authenticity. And so the messengers need to utilize the modes of communication that are most authentic to them. If you are a young woman politician who really is into your makeup and beauty, do a collab with an influencer who talks about beauty, makeup, get ready with me videos. If you're a congressman who really likes to fish, go on a fishing podcast. If you like to cook, do a cooking podcast. There's kind of a way to use your personality, your hobbies, your strengths, and show your unique self through the modes of communication, because every sort of niche internet community exists, and there's a way for politicians to utilize those to their advantage.
And this is very important because this is going to be a big thing in 2028 and maybe even in the midterms. The question of authenticity and being real is more of a question that's being directed at Democrats over Republicans. Is that correct, Rachel?
I think so. I think that for whatever reason, young people feel like because President Trump says what he wants, is able to, fly in the face of cancel culture, he comes off as very real. He's charismatic, and people think that young people in particular think he's funny, and they appreciate that, even if they disagree with what he is saying. Whereas there has been a lot of frustration that I've heard. And this was true, especially in the lead up to the 2024 election, around this sort of policing of language that they felt Democrats were doing, and the fact that Democrats oftentimes were coming off as sort of cringe and performative. And whether or not, that is a fair criticism, it's the way that it was perceived, and politics is perception. So it matters.
Oh, when you say cringe, it's also one thing I think you have to think about there is gender. I think women are always going to face a little more pressure and get a little more criticism there. So it might have been undue, some of it that Kamala Harris got, but she did get some criticism there about, the brat summer and the coconut, and not necessarily the campaign being as authentic. I think that's kind of what you're speaking to. Hey, Elena, while the Wheelhouse was in the wild with Gen Zers, we also asked them where they turn for news and political information. Here's Lena Bosco from New Britain, Alan Quayson from Prospect, Lottie Richardson Tanaka of Stratford, and Isaac Cuevas from New Britain.
I feel like my generation and me rely on social media heavily for the news these days, which social media does a good job on spinning the news and, not giving you the exact, truth about the news.
I'd say I get a lot of my news from TikTok, Instagram, even Snapchat ads, and
some traditional media like NPR, but then also a healthy mix of streamers even.
Honestly, I don't feel like I'm really connected that much. I kind of separate myself from politics like that.
Sounds like Lottie probably knows who you are, Elena. These responses, what are they shaped by? Like the political moment we're in right now, would you say, or by everything just being really a finger swipe away.
Well, I think it goes back to what we've been talking about this whole time. This is a generation that is very distrustful of institutions, of major forces of power. And I think you have to be living under a rock to not see the internet as one of those in some ways. We've seen that in the data, at Tufts University's Circle Institute, they found that something like more than half of folks under 34, 18 to 34, have very little trust to no trust at all in social media and technology companies. And, to say that these young folks are not informed, I think is a larger question, because I think what it means to be informed is kind of changing for this generation, because people open their phones and in a matter of seconds, to get what you were saying about swiping, you can see what's happening at conflicts around the world. You can see on the ground reporting on it. You can see on the ground testimonial on it from someone who may identify more as an internet personality or influencer. You can follow, the daily lives of people who have completely different perspectives than you. And that's not to say this is in substitution for, non-biased journalism, but it does expose a generation to something that really no generation, including millennials, had at such a young age. And I think that has both given people a sense of distrust, because they know that the internet is so vast and wide, and that people's algorithms can be so different. So you could be seeing such a different perspective than even your neighbor. But at the same time, people are exposed to a lot of topics. So I think that does get at what Christian was saying of like this idea that people know a lot of things, but are still formulating their opinion on it and still learning more information. And in some cases are a little unsure of where to get that information in a way that feels fair to them.
Not so much time to do this because we have to get through one last break. So we'll do this after the break, and I'll get to it quickly. Division amongst Gen Zers, we're going to unpack it when we come back. But if you're a member of Gen Z, we want you to give us a call. Give us a call right now, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. You're listening to The Wheelhouse. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. You may know some 8 months after the presidential election that Gen Z was instrumental in returning Donald Trump to the White House. It's part of the reason there's such an effort to understand Gen Z, particularly since many of us are used to younger people leaning more liberal than their more conservative elders. We finish out today's show exploring why Gen Z's political views are the way that they are. I'm still joined by Elena Moore, Rachel Gianfazza, and Christian Paz. Are you part of Gen Z? We want you to give us a call. You only got a couple minutes left, so give us a call now. 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Part of this division, Rachel, within Gen Z that we talked about at the top of the show includes a wide range of political identities, right? So you got climate activists, young religious conservatives in there. How do we make sense of this widespread? Is it common across prior young generations to see ideas contrast within its members?
Well, any generation is not monolithic. And I think that's a crucial point that we have to hone in on. There is not one range of experience. And in part because this is the most diverse generation in American history, of course, there's going to be a range of beliefs and point of views. And I think that that diversity is also core to Gen Z's ethos on the whole. And it's part of why they're so empathetic, because for the most part, they have grown up around people who are a mix of different ethnicities and races and gender identities and sexualities. And the other thing is that this is a generation that is really anti-label. And that's part of why many people are bucking political labels as well. We see that across gender. We see that across sexual orientation. We see that across political party. And, when you think about the trends that this generation is exhibiting in terms of their political beliefs, there is a lot of anti-authority sentiment. When we just had 4 years of a Democratic administration, there's going to be a pushback to the Democratic Party, especially when they felt like the Democratic leaders were, as we said, in a few minutes ago, were a bit cringe. There was automatically going to be a pushback to that, also because the policies and the behavior, even just something like the president walking down from Air Force One, was shown on social media every single day. It was overanalyzed to the point where it drew a lot of criticism in a way that I think is different than any prior generation. And so I've been thinking a lot recently about, are Gen Z's politics really just reactionary? And will we continue to see a flip-flop between moving to the left, moving to the right, depending on the opposite of whatever administration is in charge? And I don't have the answer to that yet. I don't think we have enough history on Gen Z's voting patterns, but it's something that I've been thinking a lot about because of how critical the internet is and how native Gen Z is to that internet space.
We're going to sneak in a caller here right before we end the show here in a couple of minutes. Here's Gio from Canton. Go ahead. What's your question?
My question is, with all the corporate media that is out right now, how can Gen Z trust the average news station that you see on TV, especially with the history that we have on said shows?
Gio, can I ask you quickly, what generation are you a part of?
I am Gen Z. I was born 2002.
2002, so you're 23 years old, or 22?
Yes, sir.
All right.
23.
Thank you for calling us today, Gio. I appreciate it. Christian, you take that question.
It's a great question. It is a great question. And I think it does speak to the importance of cultivating a solid and reliable set of news and information sources. I think that's why I raised the point a little earlier about Gen Z being stuck between receiving a whole host of information, being flooded with noise, and being able to parse that is one of the major challenges, I think, for this generation going forward. I think it is true that there are concerns about, corporate influences, about censorship, about more recently about political pressure out of the White House on certain big corporations that do have news agencies as part of them. And I do think that speaks to the importance of sources like public media. But it is one of those evolving questions that we'll continue to see. I think, it'll be key.
Elena, about a minute to go here. Help us close out. As Gen Z continues to constitute a larger and larger portion of us voters, what are you going to be following?
Well, for years now, I think looking at 2022 midterms, 2018 midterms, the election of Joe Biden in 2020, I've been saying this is a generation that are Democrats voters to lose, in the sense that a lot of the issues that have fired them up, that have kind of been the base of a lot of their awakenings to politics, were inherently issues Democrats adopted. Whether that's true now and whether that message is resonating to young people is a different story. I think you can argue that Democrats have lost some of their narrative in how they appeal to this generation. And I think I'm going to be really curious to see if they can take that back in some ways. This is a generation that hasn't formed strong political views, but we do know that folks form those views while they are young. And so, I've been really interested in seeing some Democrats on podcasts talk to young folks. Pete Buttigieg went on one and said, these voters may not be Republicans yet, but they will be if Democrats don't do something about it.
That's Elena Moore of NPR. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate you coming on the show, and go to npr.org if you want to hear more of Elena. Thank you so much for coming on. Rachel Janfaza, founder of The Up and Up, a media and strategy firm focused on Gen Z. Please do subscribe to the newsletter there and follow what Rachel is doing. And political correspondent for Vox, Christian Paz. Christian, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for joining me on the Wheelhouse this morning, everybody.
Thank you
for having us.
Thank you.
Today's show was produced by Chloe Wynn, but also Isaac Moss and Coco Cooley, and they joined me in West Hartford to talk to folks. Thank you so much to them for producing this. It was edited by Patrick Scahill. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Special thanks to our social media intern, Michael Scott, for coming with us in the field, and Sam Hockaday for the great graphics you saw here today. Download the Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. Thank you so much for listening.